Good afternoon. I'm Dennis Vitorian, and this is the 25th Hour. Welcome, and thanks for joining us on this week of October 4th to the 10th, 2020. This week we are going to discuss the new restrictions put in place by Mayor De Blasio and Governor Cuomo in the face of rising coronavirus numbers. We're going to talk about how Trump, after testing positive for coronavirus not too long ago, 10 days ago, is already back out doing public events. And we're going to talk about Congress stalling its COVID relief talks and expediting Justice Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation hearing. First up is Mayor de Blasio and his administration. The mayor imposed restrictions on hard-hit areas in New York hotspots affecting 20 neighborhoods in Brooklyn and Queens. Schools that are contained within those hotspots were ordered closed by de Blasio, with students having to log on to remote instruction. Cuomo also ordered that at least 20% of students, teachers, and staff in hot zones be tested weekly for the coronavirus, in addition to de Blasio's policy of random monthly testing for students citywide. Despite public feuds with Governor Cuomo about closing businesses, the governor eventually relented and agreed with the mayor to close non-essential businesses in red zones. You can check if you're in one of the red zones yourself. Just Google COVID-19 Zone Finder, and you'll be taken to the city's zip code lookup. A total of 124 schools are now closed until at least October 24th, and 308 schools can remain open but must have the governor's weekly COVID testing. The city's public hospital system is bracing for what the New York Post calls a tidal wave of COVID admissions. Yellow school bus companies are receiving $106 million from the city for the time period where buses were idling, not going anywhere. This is in the beginning of the pandemic when there was still confusion about even whether schools are going to open at all. Teachers at Brooklyn Friends School, which is a private religious school based on Quaker values, engaged in a strike on Monday after administrators opposed plans to unionize the school. The school closed as both sides negotiated, and as of 2 days of this recording, the administration at Brooklyn Friends dropped their attempts at disbanding the teachers' union. What made matters worse for teachers citywide, the mayor said that New York City couldn't afford to pay teachers their retroactive back pay owed to them as a result of union negotiations due to budgetary issues presented by the pandemic. The city owes teachers $900 million stemming from a 2014 agreement, and de Blasio reiterated that he had no choice but to freeze the back pay. The mayor eventually struck a deal with the union to pay half of the back pay this fiscal year and then half the next fiscal year. The teachers' union managed to also get the promise that teachers wouldn't be laid off this year and would receive a 3% pay hike next May that was previously agreed to. There were protests by the Orthodox Jewish community this week in response to de Blasio and Cuomo's new COVID restrictions. The Orthodox Jewish community members in Borough Park specifically protested and rioted over COVID restrictions, including mask mandates. Despite bans on mass gatherings, Orthodox Jews have come out in droves to funerals and weddings, precipitating a rise in coronavirus infection rates. After the mayor stepped up enforcement, Orthodox Jews set a fire in the middle of the street, throwing masks into the flames. There were those agitating and inciting violence, such as city council candidate and right-wing shock jockey Heshi Tischler, who said this was war and the Jewish community were his soldiers. Tischler also said disgusting things about de Blasio's wife, Shirlane McRae, calling her a retard and a whore in Yiddish.
The next city inspector, we're going to make a simchas base shaver. You are my soldiers! We are at war! We're going to get de Blasio! And if you think Mrs. de Blasio, crane, retard, woman, curve, whatever you are, you think you're going to get elected to borough president, you will not be elected. Heshi's going to go to all your little things, and I'm going to scream, and I'm going to dance, and yes, I'll act a little crazy, which is nothing new, right? Yeah. I know. It's okay, but I'll try to be more normal. Can I be more normal? Yeah.
Tischler himself went on Twitter to announce he was going to be arrested on Monday. Jacob Kornblue, a reporter for Jewish Insider, was also injured after a crowd of Orthodox Jews called him a snitch and attacked him en masse, and a 34-year-old Hasidic Jewish man was beaten unconscious by an angry crowd. Setting the violent conflict aside, the Orthodox community voiced anger against de Blasio and Cuomo for anti-Semitic rhetoric and confusing public pronouncements. For instance, Cuomo used an image of a funeral years ago to showcase Orthodox rule-breaking and tightened population requirements for religious gatherings more than once within hours of each other to only 10 people at a time. The Agudath Israel of America, a group representing Orthodox rabbis joined by the Diocese of Brooklyn, sued Cuomo's order limiting religious gatherings in houses of worship, but the federal judge rejected their challenge, saying that Cuomo had the right to institute public health regulations and that those rules didn't violate the First Amendment free exercise clause. At the same time, the New York Board of Rabbis said Hasidic protests were shameful and asked the Jewish community to follow COVID guidelines. On Friday, 300 congregants of the Bobo 45 synagogue on 15th Avenue in Borough Park, led by Grand Rabbi Mordechai David Unger, led a prayer service in open defiance of Cuomo's restrictions. Unger himself tested positive for coronavirus, but still led the service for 5 hours regardless. A video showed a driver speeding through a crowd of cyclists who were protesting police brutality on Saturday evening, injuring 2 people. No arrests have been made. Traffic fatalities in the city have risen despite there being less cars due to the pandemic. 175 people have died this year, which is up 6 deaths from last year. The NYPD has also not fined or disciplined a single cop for failing to wear masks despite 150 complaints from New Yorkers piling up. And while no officers arrested any Orthodox protesters during their Borough Park protests, officers arrested 4 Black Lives Matter protesters in a separate protest at the same time, according to The Gothamist. Officer Francisco Garcia, who's seen on video putting his knee on the neck of a man in the East Village back in May, will be charged internally according to the PBA. The NYPD released new guidelines that allow police officers to break up protests if there is a spike in coronavirus infections in the area. The City Department of Corrections announced that the Manhattan Detention Complex and the Otis Bantam Correctional Center on Rikers Island are closing at the end of November. The closures are part of a law passed by the City Council that seeks to close Rikers Island in general and create 4 smaller jails in every borough except Staten Island, with the goal of putting prisoners, their families, and lawyers closer to home. Maya Wiley, de Blasio's former legal counsel and advisor, formally launched her campaign this week. Despite calling herself the ideological soulmate of de Blasio before, she set out to separate herself from the mayor.
In her campaign video, the longtime civil rights activist says she plans to bring an entirely new element to City Hall in 2021 if she gets elected.
I am not a conventional candidate, but changing it up isn't the risk. Electing the same kinds of people, bringing the same old broken promises over and over again, and expecting things will be different. That's the risk we can't afford right now.
The Jim Owls Liberal Democratic Club is in hot water for excluding the only gay mayoral candidate from their upcoming mayoral debate, Lori Sutton, because she is not liberal enough for them, according to the New York Post. Comptroller Scott Stringer, another mayoral candidate, received an endorsement from longstanding Manhattan Congressman Adriano Espaillat. In surprising news, Councilmember Carlos Menchaca filed papers exploring a mayoral run himself. His recent work, Killing a Deal to Redevelop Industry City, will be the first thing on the minds of those assessing his potential run. De Blasio announced his administration is getting ready to put homeless people in hotels for at least another 6 months as the pandemic continues to rage on, reaching an agreement with the Hotel Association while facing community outroar for homeless hotels being set up in what they say as their backyards. De Blasio announced he also wants to rezone the upscale neighborhood of Soho, which stands for south of Houston Street, and allow more residential buildings. De Blasio says that upwards of 800 affordable units can be built, setting up a fight with those who oppose the building of affordable housing in a neighborhood known for its expensive shops and crowds of tourists. Move on to the City Council, when we're going to talk about Andy King's expulsion. Bronx Councilman Andy King was officially ousted from the City Council in an official council session, marking a first for the chamber. You may recall the councilman was found by an ethics committee to have broken rules related to sexual harassment, using council funds for planning a vacation, obstructing justice into his investigation, for never attending training meant to correct his behavior, and antagonizing the official monitor for his case. King filed a lawsuit against New York City in federal court saying that he was racially discriminated against, and King's sexual harassment claims led to an audit into the City Council's sexual harassment policies, yet the audit has been stuck for months since the contract for the audit expired. It's not still going to help Andy at this point. De Blasio said that a special election will take place on December 22nd to replace King's seat. City Council held a hearing on Wednesday with NYCHA officials to question the agency about an investigation led by the publication The City, and it's about NYCHA's denial that their old and broken ventilation systems had anything to do with the spread of coronavirus throughout the public housing system. Councilman Richie Torres, who was there at the hearing, was one of the members who scoffed at NYCHA's denial. Moving on to Governor Cuomo. The governor said the state will take better control of COVID regulations in New York City hotspots, promising that businesses breaking the rules will be shut down. There have been calls for the governor to step in because there's been a lot of confusion about what de Blasio wants to do. But it's not clear a lot of the times what Cuomo wants to do either. There was a lot of confusion over who was going to take the reins following flare-ups in corona rates in New York City. Soon after de Blasio announced restrictions in certain zip codes where flare-ups occurred, Cuomo stepped in with his own directives. And on Monday, Cuomo said he wouldn't allow New York City to close non-essential businesses in 9 hotspots, which went around de Blasio. And we reported earlier that he ended up agreeing with De Blasio and closing those businesses if they're in a red zone. Cuomo also announced the closure of schools for a day earlier than De Blasio had announced, and both men came out with two different maps of New York City's hot zones, with critics saying Cuomo's map, which seemingly cut across buildings without conforming to the street grid, didn't inform anyone of whether they lived in a hot zone or not. Cuomo's people later fixed the map, making sure the street grid was conformed to, but New Yorkers may have still found De Blasio's list of zip codes more informative. Regardless of Cuomo's hard-edged attitude towards people not wearing masks and promising expensive fines, the state has yet to fine anyone for not wearing masks for months. Meanwhile, the Democrat and Chronicle reported that at least 8 New York State mayors are quarantining after one of them tested positive for COVID following a press conference that they attended, and it was put together by the New York Conference of Mayors. Cuomo announced on Friday that the State Department of Health is sending 400,000 rapid test kits to municipalities, hospitals, and healthcare providers throughout the state. October 9th was New York's deadline to register to vote, but data has been mixed on how many new voters signed up. 430,000 young eligible voters haven't signed up, a decline from 2016. The other side of the coin here, based on reporting by the Times-Union, is that more than 200,000 more voters in 3 New York districts alone who are active and registered have increased in number than in 2016. The City Board of Elections has reported processing 685,000 mail-in ballots and has resent 99,000 ballots to those who received erroneous information about a week ago, according to Executive Director Michael Ryan. De Blasio referred the absentee ballot mishap to the Department of Investigations. Eric Trump was finally deposed by investigators from the Attorney General's office who are looking into fraud in Trump's real estate organization. After months of Eric Trump dodging requests to do so, despite originally agreeing to sitting down with Letitia James and her investigators, and a judge had to force him to be deposed. The AG also announced an investigation into Jenny Rivera, who leads Aglook Inc., a Bronx homeless services provider, for commercial bribery, grand larceny, criminal possession of stolen property, falsifying business records, and more. Separately, Letitia James also reported that the state was suspending collection of medical and student debt through November 3rd due to the pandemic. Letitia James is certainly busy during this time. After Rochester Mayor Lovely Warren was indicted for campaign finance fraud last week, the mayor pleaded not guilty in front of a judge who was pretty adamant to let the mayor know that they were not going to take it easy on her. Rochester is the site of protest following the death of Daniel Prude, a black man who had a mental health illness at the time that he died at the hands of Rochester cops that put a bag over Prude's head. Rochester's police chief was fired, and it seemed heads were rolling for the incident, but protesters were demanding the resignation of one more person, Mayor Warren. Warren was also subpoenaed by the very same committee that she created, as well as Police Chief Leroy Singleton, in its investigation of the Daniel Prude case. In Suffolk County, the county lawmakers are thinking about raising the smoking age to 25, restricting cigarette and vapor products, which would make it the most restrictive age limit in the country. In Buffalo, an 80-year-old man died this week after he was pushed to the ground by a bar patron following the 80-year-old man's request for the bar patron to put on a mask.
80-year-old Rocco Sapienza said something to Lewinsky about him not wearing a mask. The DA says Lewinsky then pushed Sapienza hard. The 80-year-old fell over, hit his head, and was knocked out. Lewinsky left the bar. Sapienza was taken to the hospital, where he remained unresponsive for 4 days. He died on September 30th. Lewinsky is charged with criminally negligent homicide.
We all see it for the past 5 or 6 months. We see these Karens out there in Walmarts who aren't wearing masks and who get in confrontation with people not wearing masks. We see it today on an airplane. We see it everywhere where people are confronting one another and having arguments about not wearing masks. And it's unfortunate that we have an incident here now in Western New York where this escalated into a 80-year-old man passing away.
Lewinsky was arrested and released earlier this afternoon. He's expected back in West Seneca Town Court tomorrow night. Reporting in West Seneca, Jeff Rusak, 7 Eyewitness News.
Cuomo thinks that a federal aid package for New York is still possible after he spoke with House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin. New York is in a budget hole due to the pandemic, decimating the state budget and the funding of programs. State Comptroller Thomas DiNapoli reported that local governments are struggling as their tax revenue dried up because less customers are going out and buying things. Cuomo said he's waiting to see who wins the presidential election before making any, quote, damaging budgetary decisions. Buffalo News reported that the Higher Education Services Corporation, the state agency in charge of the Excelsior College Scholarship Program, said that scholarship funds may be limited due to budget constraints from the pandemic. New York is facing one of its most dire budget crises it has had in decades. Moving on to Albany, Bronx Assemblyman Jeffrey Dinowitz criticized the plan this week to cut older judges and called it age discrimination. A $300 million cut to the state's judiciary branch in accordance with COVID budgetary constraints forced Chief Judge Janet DeFiore to cut more than 40 judges, but Dinowitz said in a letter to Chief Administrative Judge Lawrence Marks that the move would, quote, exacerbate the crisis facing our court system. The well-known former Republican State Senate Majority Leader Joe Bruno has died this week at 91 at his Brunswick residence. Bruno was a Republican known for his fierce advocacy for the capital region of New York and his overthrow of Ralph Marino as Republican Majority Leader in 1994. Bruno served in the Senate from 1977 to 2008 when he abruptly stepped down in the midst of investigations into his mixing of public and private duties. Bruno was originally convicted in 2009 on federal corruption charges, but a retrial acquitted him in 2014. Political New York reported that state lawmakers plan to introduce the New York HERO Act, a state version of the Federal HERO Act, which gave us the $600 unemployment insurance and $1,200 checks. The New York HERO Act is meant to codify workplace protections in the age of COVID. Assemblywoman Karina Reyes and State Senator Michael Ginares have sponsored the law meant to fine violating businesses, encouraging workers to report violating businesses, and protect workers from retaliation. Moving on to the state courts, the Bronx County Clerk Luis Diaz was suspended following a state investigation by the Attorney General and a raid in his office. Diaz is a former assemblyman who has been a clerk now for a decade. According to the New York Post, the probe may have something to do with Diaz's ties to a not-for-profit group, but more information is incoming. Manhattan Supreme Court Justice Lawrence Love ruled that police can be criminally charged for defying New York City's ban on chokeholds. The law is currently being challenged in court as well, and police unions sought to get a preliminary injunction preventing the law from being enforced while it was being challenged in a separate court case. But the judge declined the request. Despite the ban being in place following a series of police brutality incidents, city officials are already starting to move forward with possibly undoing the ban, such as Queens Councilman Bob Holden. Another councilman from Queens, Donovan Richards, had already introduced an amendment to the bill that would loosen the legal language for cops by requiring that chokeholds be shown to have been performed recklessly. Bob Holden wants to get rid of it entirely. Manhattan Supreme Court Justice Deborah James agreed with Attorney General Letitia James in her lawsuit against two gyms. New York Sports Club and Lucille Roberts were restrained from charging members for COVID cancellations and monthly dues. State Supreme Court Justice Frank Sedita ruled that the Buffalo Police Department could release unsubstantiated and pending allegations against police officers over the objections of the Buffalo Police Union. The union sought to shield police disciplinary records of any unsubstantiated nature following the state's repeal of the 50A law that earlier wouldn't have allowed the public to see any disciplinary record for any cop. A New York City cyclist who was injured on the Brooklyn Bridge after colliding with a pedestrian settled with New York City for $75,000 in a lawsuit which alleged that the City Department of Transportation created a risk of harm for not safeguarding pedestrians and cyclists on the bridge. If you have walked on the bridge, you know that there is a very thin line that is painted on the bridge, and it is very easy for pedestrians and cyclists to collide with one another. The state bar exam took place this week. Congratulations to those future budding lawyers that took the bar. Despite efforts to pass what's called diploma privilege, which would have let students practice law on the basis of getting their JD, the state bar committee still made students take the bar, and setting up test rooms in the state's law schools as one way to prevent mass infection. Usually the way the bar exam goes down, it's either in a mass testing center such as Javits Center, or in a smaller testing center that can be set up in upstate New York. We move on to Trump, and there's a lot to go over this week when it comes to Trump. The coronavirus that he tested positive for, his staff getting sick, and obviously his administration doing all the fun things they do. Trump, earlier this week when he was still staying at Walter Reed, decided it was a good idea to get in his car, his motorcade, and drive around waving to his supporters who started camping out and lining outside of Walter Reed to show their support for the president while he was being treated. And he was heavily criticized for this because he was essentially putting Secret Service agents in harm's way. One picture showing Trump waving, he was wearing a mask inside the car to his credit, but the passenger and driver in the front seat are wearing a face shield, face mask, gown, gloves, the whole 9 yards. Trump didn't disclose a first positive test on Thursday while awaiting for a second test. He never mentioned it when he went on Fox News. And there was frustration with his chief of staff, Mark Meadows, as he wasn't giving consistent information. along with Trump's doctors. It froze the president's campaign just when it needed a boost so close to the election. And more and more senators keep getting positive results stemming from a Rose Garden event where Trump announced his nomination for Judge Amy Coney Barrett to replace the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Trump left Walter Reed Monday night and went back to the White House to continue treatment despite conflicting information about his health. And when the president got to the White House, he was criticized for taking off his mask after coming out to the White House balcony, where it was clearly visible he was having a hard time breathing, and then walked back into the White House without his mask off, in clear sight of other people inside. This man was contagious and walked right into the White House. Trump also returned to the Oval Office while still infected, with multiple experts and officials raising alarms that Trump was infesting the entire White House while being sick with a contagious disease. Trump released videos telling people not to be afraid of the virus, not to let it dominate their lives. He said that he was actually blessed for getting sick, and maybe that he was even immune from the virus.
I just left Walter Reed Medical Center, and it's really something very special. The doctors, the nurses, the first responders, and I learned so much about coronavirus. And one thing that's for certain, don't let it dominate you. Don't be afraid of it. You're going to beat it. We have the best medical equipment. We have the best medicines, all developed recently. And you're going to beat it. I didn't feel so good. And 2 days ago, I could have left 2 days ago. 2 days ago, I felt great, like better than I have in a long time. I said just recently, better than 20 years ago. Don't let it dominate. Don't let it take over your lives. Don't let that happen. We have the greatest country in the world. We're going back to work. We're going to be out front. As your leader, I had to do that. I knew there's danger to it, but I had to do it. I stood out front. I led. Nobody that's a leader would not do what I did. And I know there's a risk, there's a danger, but that's okay. And now I'm better, and maybe I'm immune. I don't know. But don't let it dominate your lives. Get out there. Be careful. We have the best medicines in the world, and it all happened very shortly, and they're all getting approved, and the vaccines are coming momentarily. Thank you very much. And Walter Reed, what a group of people. Thank you very much.
Facebook and Twitter had to take down those videos Trump was spreading, falsely claiming the coronavirus is less deadly than the flu. Facebook also banned QAnon across all its platforms, bringing down the Trump-supporting network that believes in conspiracy theories that Democrats and Democratic politicians eat children and provide a safe haven for militia groups calling for violence. Facebook additionally announced that it will temporarily ban all political ads in the U.S. after the polls close on November 3rd, and took action against a marketing firm running a troll farm on behalf of Turning Point USA, a pro-Trump conservative youth group, removing 200 accounts, 55 pages, and 76 Instagram accounts. Twitter came out with its own rules to counter manipulation in advance of Election Day, saying that no candidate is allowed to claim victory until two credible news outlets project their victory, nor can a candidate encourage political interference during the electoral process. Over the next few days, more and more White House officials tested positive for COVID. On October 5th, news broke that Trump's press secretary, Kayleigh McEnany, tested positive, along with two of her staff, Caroline Leavitt and Chad Gilmartin. Trump's doctor cleared him for public events starting this past Saturday, despite his first public positive test 10 days ago, with Trump supposedly not being symptomatic anymore. The Trump campaign held a de facto rally at the White House that same day, with Trump's doctor saying that the president is no longer contagious. A report by Political's Dan Goldberg, Alice Miranda Allstein, and Rachel Rubin examined the Trump campaign's planning regarding COVID safeguards, especially after the fact that the president got sick, but there are still few protections. Okay, to his credit, the de facto rally that Trump had on Saturday, you could see that most people are wearing masks. However, there was no social distancing to be seen. It was also reported that the highest echelon of the military also quarantined this week after reports came out that the Joint Chiefs of Staff were exposed to a COVID-positive Coast Guard Navy official. Then it was reported that Trump's aide Stephen Miller tested positive for COVID. National Institutes of Health Director Dr. Fauci said that unless more precautions are taken against the pandemic, the death toll can reach 300,000 or 400,000 fatalities. The Rose Garden event that announced Amy Coney Barrett's Supreme Court nomination is deemed a super spreader event with potentially exposing thousands of people to the virus from Atlanta to Minnesota, according to an investigation by USA Today. The president blamed him getting sick on Gold Star family, saying all come up close to him in public meet and greets. An investigation from NBC News had shown that Trump asked Walter Reed doctors to sign non-disclosure agreements last year, following a surprise trip to the hospital last November. We still don't know what happened after Trump suddenly went to Walter Reed last year. The White House said it was just a routine physical. Harris and Pence debated in the midst of the president's COVID treatment. It was a much calmer debate than what was seen between Trump and Biden the week before, but still with many inaccuracies still hurled from both sides. The two sides originally argued about whether to install plexiglass screens between Harris and Pence, with Pence saying they were refusing the installation of the protective screens, but eventually relented. Key takeaways from the debate include the obvious difference in tone in this debate from the presidential debate, the candidates both dodging questions left and right. Notably, Pence was dodging questions left and right about the administration's response to coronavirus, but also Kamala Harris didn't do Joe Biden any favors by dodging questions about whether Democrats are going to pack the Supreme Court. And, of course, the fly that landed on Pence's head.
Unlike the first presidential debate, Harris and Pence avoided personal attacks while being mostly cordial.
He will not raise taxes on anybody who makes less than $400,000 a year.
He said he's going to repeal the Trump tax cuts.
Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking.
Well, wait.
I'm speaking.
Harris and Pence, separated by plexiglass, sparred over the Trump administration's handling of the coronavirus.
They knew and they covered it up. The president said it was a hoax.
President Donald Trump did what no other American president had ever done. And that was he suspended all travel from China, the second largest economy in the world. Now, Senator Joe Biden opposed that decision.
Whatever the vice president is claiming the administration has done, clearly it hasn't worked. When you're looking at over 210,000 dead bodies in our country.
The moderator pressing the vice president, the head of the coronavirus task force, about what appears to have been a super spreader event at the White House.
Many of the people who were at that event, Susan, actually were tested for coronavirus. And it was an outdoor event, which all of our scientists regularly and routinely advise.
The topic later turning to abortion, with Supreme Court nominee Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation hearing only days away.
I'm pro-life. I don't apologize for it. And this is another one of those cases where there's such a dramatic contrast.
I will always fight for a woman's right to make a decision about her own body. It should be her decision and not that of Donald Trump and the vice president, Michael Pence.
With back at the debate, Pence argued a Biden administration would be a disaster for the economy, while Harris claimed the Trump administration's policies are more harmful to most American families.
Joe Biden says democracy's on the ballot. Make no mistake about it, Susan. The American economy, the American comeback is on the ballot.
Joe Biden believes you measure the health and the strength of America's economy based on the health and the strength of the American worker and the American family.
And another big moment was when Mike Pence attacked Joe Biden for his handling of the swine flu back in 2009. That was during the Obama administration when 60 million Americans were infected compared to 7.5 million for the coronavirus now. And while fact checkers were quick to point out that those numbers from Pence may be correct, they note that the coronavirus has been far deadlier. Kenneth, Mona?
Andrew Dimber, they're live in Washington. Thank you.
After the debate, there was much talk about whether Trump was still able to attend the October 15th presidential debate. The Committee on Presidential Debates made the decision to make it virtual instead of the original town hall format. Biden said he would have still attended, but Trump categorically refused, saying that the virtual debates are not what debates are about and didn't want someone else controlling his mic. The committee made the decision to cancel the October 15th debate as a result, with Biden deciding to still hold a town hall on October 15th. The next debate between the two men is October 22nd. Dan Diamond has a story about how the Trump administration pressured the CDC to change a report about how children are affected by COVID. Despite the political pressure, the CDC did end up updating its guidelines to acknowledge that the virus can spread via tiny air particles lingering in the air. However, political pressure in other areas still exists, as the Times broke the story that the White House refused to accept proposed FDA guidelines that could delay emergency vaccine approvals until after the election. Trump has consistently promised that some sort of vaccine would be available before Election Day, despite experts overwhelmingly saying that this wouldn't be possible. Despite the White House's pushback, the FDA ended up asking vaccine developers for their safety data, continuing to show that it's highly unlikely any vaccine will be approved by Election Day. It's a month away. On Tuesday, Trump finally agreed to the FDA's guidelines on vetting vaccines, putting the nail in the coffin about anything being approved before November 3rd. Meanwhile, Eli Lilly, the pharmaceutical company, had asked the FDA this week to authorize its COVID antibody drug as an emergency authorization after Eli Lilly said its experimental drug meant for mild symptoms showed positive results, and Regeneron, the company that provided President Trump with its experimental COVID drug, also asked the FDA for emergency approval. But its drug is meant for extreme cases, which only fuels more questions about the status of President Trump's health. More stories came out that show the contempt Trump officials showed towards practicing safe behaviors during the pandemic. A New York Times report recounts episodes where Vice President Pence's chief of staff, Mark Short, refused to wear a mask on board Air Force Two because, according to him, the Democrats could use Pence wearing a mask against him. An Atlanta Journal-Constitution investigation reported about how Trump's chief of staff, Mark Meadows, hosted a wedding for his daughter despite statewide virus restrictions. The Wall Street Journal reported that according to people familiar with the matter, the Trump administration is aiming to reopen travel between New York City and London with shorter quarantine periods by the holidays. The U.S. had hit 58,000 infections in one day on Friday, the highest infection number in 2 months. 6 states had also set single-day records, including Missouri, Montana, North Dakota, Ohio, Oklahoma, and West Virginia. The pandemic is not over. The Washington Post's Peter Whoriskey, Douglas Macmillan, and Jonathan O'Connell came out with a report showing that the U.S. plans to spend more on COVID relief than on the entire war in Afghanistan. $4 trillion and counting, with most of that money going to businesses that, in some cases, didn't need the money and fired people anyway. Speaking of Afghanistan, Trump's National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien announced that the U.S. would cut troops there to 2,500 by early next year, but then Trump undercut him by saying that the timeline is actually going to move up to Christmas. Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell said that the U.S. faces tragic economic consequences from not doing enough to support the economy. Powell warned that the economic recovery is going to take longer than expected and that existing racial and wealth disparities will only get worse. Hours after Powell said this, the president suspended negotiations for COVID relief in a tweet, saying that talks wouldn't continue until after the election, which made election officials, election experts scratch their head. Trump quickly reversed course after the markets dropped, releasing his wish list individually over Twitter, noticeably leaving out unemployment relief, but keeping everything else originally on the table, such as $1,200 checks. Trump then announced he's offering a $1.8 trillion package to Nancy Pelosi, up from $1.6 trillion. The U.S. goods trade deficit also hit a record high in August at $83.9 billion. The Labor Department released a report this past Thursday which showed that U.S. unemployment claims remain above 800,000. Even though the number of claims fell steadily throughout the months of the pandemic, the drop in the claims does not necessarily reflect gainful employment during this so-called recovery. It's because people are exhausting the amount of time their state unemployment programs have, so they're dropping out of the so-called system and fending for themselves. Trump's agricultural secretary, Sonny Perdue, continues to land in hot ethical waters for mixing his official and political duties. Politico's Ryan McRimmon wrote about something we also mentioned last week, chiefly the USDA trying to stuff Trump letters into food boxes for the poor, trying to take credit for the food program. It only continues concerns about Trump's officials mixing government and political business. The IRS announced it's investigating NRA CEO Wayne LaPierre for tax fraud related to his personal taxes. The National Rifle Association was sued by the New York Attorney General for breaking charities laws back in August, seeking dissolution for charges related to overcompensating executives, paying board members who aren't supposed to take a paycheck, and for LaPierre using member dues for Italian suits and jet rides, all while the NRA used only 10% of its funds on actual gun safety and education programs. The gun organization has also taken blame for consorting with Russian agents to destabilize the 2016 presidential election, according to a Senate finance report released in September of last year. 2 ISIS terrorists making up half of the named Beatles terrorists for their British accents were brought to the U.S. to face federal terrorism charges and were indicted for their involvement in the Islamic terrorist group and the execution of U.S. hostages in Syria. The 2 terrorists were extradited from the UK after a 2-year debate between the US and UK over whether the terrorists would face death penalty charges here. Attorney General Bill Barr promised they wouldn't, and in exchange, the UK extradited the 2 ISIS terrorists. A draft Inspector General report revealed that when Jeff Sessions was Attorney General, he told prosecutors in a meeting that, quote, "we need to take away children." When discussing Trump's migrant detaining policy, Rod Rosenstein, then the Deputy Attorney General, said it didn't matter how young the children were either. The Trump administration is still detaining migrant children and has still not reunited most of those families. The Department of Justice also released an email from the Public Integrity section saying that prosecutors can take steps to publicly release information on any investigation into postal workers or military employees accused of election fraud before the polls close, even if those public steps risk affecting the electoral outcome. Election officials all over the state are scrambling to prevent conflicts between voters at polling places as Trump encourages his supporters to watch the polls, or what some critics say, participate in voter intimidation. Politico's Alex Eisenstadt and Natasha Korecki reported that Trump's campaign admits to assembling what they call is an army of volunteers numbering 50,000 in states like North Carolina and Pennsylvania. As Election Day gets closer, Trump announced he ordered the declassification of documents related to the investigation into whether former President Obama spied on Trump's campaign and its involvement in the Trump-Russia investigation. There is no evidence that Obama or Hillary Clinton maliciously spied on Trump's campaign, and in fact, multiple members of Trump's campaign have been jailed or indicted for lying to the FBI for their ties to Russian agents helping Trump's campaign. The Director of National Intelligence, John Ratcliffe, had sent over 1,000 documents at the request of John Durham, a U.S. attorney who was set up by Attorney General Bill Barr to look into whether the FBI inappropriately handled its investigation into the Trump campaign. Durham was expected to release a report before Election Day on conservatives' hopes that it would show massive corruption in the FBI investigation, but Bill Barr told Republicans that Durham's report won't be even ready by Election Day after all. The latest Trump associate that has been charged with federal criminal counts is Elliot Broidy, who was the Republican National Committee Deputy Finance Chair. He allegedly violated the Foreign Agents Registration Act by lobbying the U.S. government on behalf of 1MDB, which is a strategic development arm for the Malaysian government, which is itself embroiled in a scandal in Malaysia. Court documents reveal that the FBI charged 6 people that are part of a militia in a plot to kidnap the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer. Social media posts show that the militia looked forward to an overthrow of the government and to take part in it. The FBI investigation also showed how sophisticated the group was in planning, knowing where the governor was going to be, the layout of her surroundings, and how to get away with kidnapping her. And after kidnapping her, the group wanted to hold a trial against Whitmer for treason. 7 other alleged members of the militia were charged with state criminal charges rather than the federal ones charged to the other 6. Governor Whitmer took strong decisive action at the outset of the coronavirus pandemic, which the Republican state legislature said was a power grab, pointing to Whitmer's constant signing of executive orders defining what the public can or can't do, including what people can buy at the store. Armed protesters stormed the Michigan State Capitol building, protesting virus restrictions, with pictures infamously showing armed, unmasked men getting in the face of Capitol Police. As time went on, Whitmer relaxed her pandemic restrictions, and a state judge even struck down a number of Whitmer's orders. The Department of Justice made public this week indictments of 6 current and former chicken industry executives for price fixing. The alleged price fixing took place from 2012 to 2019 and included companies such as Pilgrim's Pride, Claxton Poultry Farms, and Tyson Foods. Citigroup was fined $400 million and was ordered to fix its risk management systems after federal regulators found significant deficiencies, according to the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency and the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve and the OCC had recently also fined Wells Fargo more than $1 billion for the same issue, reining in the ability of banks to handle their clients' cash in a loose manner. Seema Verma, the person in charge of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, tweeted her support for paying out the rest of the money for a program meant for aiding 9/11 first responders. The Trump administration withheld $4 million meant for 9/11 first responders, admitted to withholding it, and then refused to pay it out. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin sent a letter to Mayor de Blasio suggesting that he make up the $4 million that is being withheld from the program. The Department of Justice filed a lawsuit against Yale University, accusing the elite university for discriminating against Asian and white applicants in its undergraduate admissions. The Justice Department originally gave Yale 2 weeks to change their admissions practices or else it would be sued, but the university refused, denying any discrimination. Specifically, Yale is being accused of using a system that, while it isn't like quotas, is similar to it by, quote, balancing racial percentages. The case is reminiscent of a lawsuit against Harvard by a group called Students for Fair Admissions, saying that the university also discriminated against Asians and whites, but lost the case because they couldn't prove Harvard's admission practices were actually discriminatory. The DOJ filed papers against Harvard in that case. Supreme Court precedent says that while quotas are unconstitutional, creating a diverse student body is allowed. We reported a couple of weeks earlier about how Voice of America, the government-run news program that Trump oversees, has been criticized after Trump appointed a new CEO that in turn made changes such as dismissing officials that disagreed with his direction of the news publication. CEO Michael Pack is being sued by 5 former officials alleging that the editorial direction of the news service stressed including conservative talking points more often. Moving on to Congress. Jewish members of Congress are facing an alarming increase in anti-Semitic tweets, according to a report by the Anti-Defamation League. The ADL reviewed 5,942 tweets aimed at 30 Jewish Congress members, including Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer and Representative Gerald Nadler, who received the bulk of the tweets. On the House side, A House Judiciary Committee report spanning 449 pages said that the four big tech companies, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google, abused their monopoly power reminiscent of oil barons and railroad tycoons, dictating prices and rules in areas such as e-commerce, searches, advertising, social networking, and publishing. The committee called for large changes to antitrust laws to address the power of the four companies and suggested breaking them up. New York Representative Elise Stefanik, who received attention for her defense of President Trump during his impeachment hearing, has 3 times the cash advantage than her opponent Ted Cobb, according to the Times-Union. House Speaker Pelosi and Treasury Secretary Mnuchin are still negotiating a COVID relief package, despite the overwhelming opposition to passing such relief on the Republican side. Whether it be the president feeling like he doesn't want to do it one day and then changing his mind, to Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell saying he won't pass a House plan. Now Pelosi said that she's tying industry aid to a broader stimulus bill, in particular the airline industry, which laid off more than 70,000 of its workers unless they get more money. Pelosi is saying that unless the industry stimulus is being tied to helping people in general, nothing can be passed. Pelosi was already separately in the news this week for announcing a bill to create a commission looking into the president's capacity to lead pursuant to the 25th Amendment. The amendment basically says that if the president isn't able to serve in their official duties, they have the authority to temporarily appoint the vice president to step into the presidential shoes until that incapacity is over. Past presidents have done this when they had to undergo surgery, for example. Reagan and George H.W. Bush did it. But another part of the amendment, specifically Section 4, this says that the vice president and either the cabinet or any other group that is so congressionally authorized can jointly agree that the president is unable to fulfill their duties and force them to step aside. Moving on to the Senate, positive results of COVID cases raises doubts about Barrett's hearing. Despite more Republicans testing positive for the virus, the Senate Judiciary Committee, held by Lindsey Graham, who himself failed to take a COVID test before a debate in his re-election in South Carolina, they plan to hold Barrett's confirmation hearing anyway with a mixed in-person and virtual format. Senator Pat Toomey has announced that he's not running for re-election or governor of Pennsylvania like he planned. He didn't immediately give an explanation. Senator Roger Wicker from Mississippi got in trouble for having his mask off for extended periods on a flight and had to be reminded twice by flight attendants to put his mask on. Moving on to the judiciary branch. The Supreme Court started a new term without Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Remember that any time the vote means that the lower court's ruling stands as if the Supreme Court never took on a case. Washington Post Robert Barnes wrote about how the Supreme Court refused to hear the Kim Davis same-sex marriage case. This was about a Kentucky government clerk who refused to issue same-sex marriage licenses, saying her religion forbid it. The more remarkable fact to come out of that story is the dissent written by conservative justices Thomas and Alito, who mentioned that the landmark same-sex marriage case Obergefell v. Hodges should never have been decided for its same-sex petitioners. The Supreme Court took the side of South Carolina Republicans on Monday, ordering that the state can reinstate a witness requirement for mail-in ballots, while ballots already sent in without witness signatures can be counted. Various court cases around the country are dealing with appeals set around mail-in voting and its legal requirements throughout the states. The most recent development in that field involved Texas's Governor Greg Abbott. Abbott instituted a new rule that every county could only have one drop box for mail-in ballots, even though Texas counties have vastly varying degrees of population numbers. U.S. District Judge Robert Pittman of the Western District of Texas issued an injunction against Abbott's order, saying the move disenfranchised elderly and disabled Texans. Legally, the federal courts are very hesitant to get involved in any kind of electioneering rules so close to an election unless people can prove that those election rules disenfranchise marginal groups. And ever since the Voting Rights Act has been gorged by the Supreme Court, it's been harder and harder to prove voter discrimination cases. A landmark case involving tech giants Google and Oracle are heading to the Supreme Court, with Google defending itself against charges that it stole Oracle's code to build its Android operating system. The late Justice Ginsburg was a known vote in Oracle's favor, potentially shaking up predicting the legal outcome of the case. The Supreme Court refused to hear an appeal from a New York City developer who destroyed the work of 21 graffiti artists at a Queens warehouse known as 5 Points. G&M Realty was fined $6.75 million for destroying 45 murals in 2013, and the Supreme Court's refusal to hear the case keeps the lower court's ruling, which established that graffiti was a sufficient form of art that can be protected by law. The Trump administration is fighting all over the courts to try to end the census count early, despite a prior judge's ruling that the count continue until the end of October. The Wall Street Journal's Paul Overberg wrote about how the administration's attempts at cutting the census are tied to excluding undocumented immigrants, even after a July Supreme Court case prevented a question on the census asking about migrants' immigration status. Trump appealed the ruling, forcing the Commerce Department to keep counting the census until the end of October to the Ninth Circuit. But a 3-judge panel there decided against the president, who has now appealed to the Supreme Court. The Constitution mandates that the census be taken every 10 years, and it does not specify that the census has to be only counted towards citizens. The Constitution says that the census must account for all persons. A Second Circuit Court of Appeals panel ruled that Trump can't block enforcement of a New York grand jury subpoena for 8 years of his tax returns on the basis of the subpoena being overbroad or issued in bad faith. The subpoena was issued in connection with the Manhattan DA's investigation into Trump paying porn star Stormy Daniels hush money to keep their affair quiet for the 2016 election. The Supreme Court had already ruled that the DA had the right to seek Trump's tax returns from his accountants at Mazars USA, and that Trump was not above the law. Trump plans to appeal to the Supreme Court again anyway. Trump's taxes have been the focal point of many people since the start of Trump's campaign. He said that he couldn't release his tax returns because it was being audited by the IRS, which is not a thing. You don't have to keep your tax returns quiet because of an audit. There is no rule preventing that. The New York Times recently revealed that Trump hasn't paid federal income taxes in decades. He paid $750 in 2016 and in 2017. The New York Times report also showed that Trump lied to the IRS and regulators and owes more than $400 million to unknown creditors. The Washington Post reported that Trump received a $21 million tax break for preserving the forest around his Seven Springs mansion in New York based on an appraisal, and now the IRS is investigating that tax break as part of their audit. And the New York Times came out with part 3 of their report into Trump's taxes, revealing that Trump received $21 million through a windfall provided by Trump's own Las Vegas hotel. Trump owns a hotel and casino with his friend Phil Ruffin, with the reporting implying that Ruffin funneled Trump's money to his campaign in 2016 because Trump was short of cash. Ruffin said that the money, which he says is actually $28 million, not 21, is legitimately for back pay that is owed to Trump. And then the Times released their 4th part of the report, examining how 200 companies, special interest groups, and foreign governments received special favors from the Trump administration after they spent millions of dollars at his properties during his presidency. Nationally, California wildfires are still blazing. They've surpassed 4 million acres. They've killed 31 people as of the time of this recording. Hurricane Delta hit land in Louisiana as a Category 2 storm this week. It started as a Category 4 shortly after formation, becoming the 9th major hurricane this year. Delta battered Mexican resorts in Cancun before shortly making its way up to the Gulf and weakening. The Gulf states are still experiencing winds up to 105 miles per hour and 11 feet of flooding and were ordered to evacuate. 2 Americans, Harvey Alter and Charles Rice, are among a team of 3 to receive the Nobel Prize in Medicine for their discovery of hepatitis C. Another American, Andrea Ghez, won the Nobel Prize in Physics for her contribution to the exploration and discovery into how black holes work in space. The American poet Louise Gluck was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature for her poetry and what the Nobel Committee called, quote, her unmistakable poetic voice that with austere beauty makes individual existence universal, end quote. And maybe to Trump's annoyance, the Nobel Peace Prize eventually went to the World Health Organization's food program. A Texas police officer was charged with murder after killing a black man at a gas station this week. Officer Sean Lucas killed Jonathan Price after Price intervened in a fight between a man and woman at the Quick Check gas station in Wolf City, Texas. Officer Lucas received a call about a disturbance around 8:24 p.m. and after arriving on the scene, tried detaining Price, used a stun gun, and then shot him. The Texas Ranger said that Officer Price's actions do not indicate objectionable reasonableness and fired him. Meanwhile, Minneapolis officer Derek Chauvin, who placed his knee on the neck of George Floyd, killing him, was released on $1 million bond. The gun-toting couple from St. Louis, Missouri, Mark and Patricia McCloskey, have been indicted by a grand jury on felony unlawful use of a weapon and tampering with evidence charges. The couple are infamously seen in videos and photos brandishing their guns on their lawn while police brutality protesters were walking on the street in their gated community. The McCloskeys have become Republican folk heroes, featured most recently in the Republican National Convention. Missouri Governor Mike Parson had promised to pardon the couple if they were convicted. And finally, we end the show with the news of legendary guitarist Eddie Van Halen passing away this week at 65 years of age due to tongue cancer after years of struggling with the disease. The guitarist is known for his renowned and acclaimed rock songs such as Running with the Devil, Eruption, and Jump. That's it for this week. for the 25th hour. Thank you for sticking with us and helping us beat the 24/7 news cycle together. Share, rate, review this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Tell it to your friends. And don't hesitate to subscribe through any of your podcast platforms. Become a patron today at Patreon. Just go on patreon.com/the25th hour news. We cannot stress enough how important your support is.